There have been 264 popes, and we will devote time to every one of them, of course. What I'm trying to do here is give you a history of the papacy which focuses on different kinds of popes with different kinds of problems and different kinds of personalities. The title of the course is self-explanatory. Some of them are really awful. I mean, like, you know, like X-rated awful. And others are, you know, very admirable, remarkable people. Also, bear in mind that this goes back to the beginning of Christianity, and documentation gets better and better and better as time goes on. Therefore, historical reliability gets better and better and better as time goes on. As you go back to the earliest years, you get more and more mixture of legends and myths and things like that. We know very little about the earliest bishops of Rome, very little. The very little we know we'll be talking about today. One way of focusing on the popes is what they had to contend with, what their problems were, what they had to solve. And that will vary in the course of time. And let me just mention two books that I think are useful here if you want to read more about them. One is O'Malley's A History of the Popes, and the other is McBrien's Lives of the Popes. They're quite different. I know both of the authors very well. O'Malley is a Renaissance historian of the first rank. He was teaching at Harvard, and now I think he's teaching at a Jesuit place somewhere. His is much more kind of narrative, skipping many popes because they're not particularly historically significant, and a kind of good read. I mean, if you just kind of read through a history of the popes, it's readable. The other one, McBrien was chairman of the religion department at Notre Dame. This is much more, every pope is in there. He gives every pope a page or two, so you can kind of take it as an encyclopedia of popes and get the basic facts about each one. And that is all historically very documented, solid, factual, unprejudiced. But I know Dick McBrien very well. He could not leave his prejudices out. So he does that and does it fine. Now, if you want a totally unprejudiced account, just read that, which is most of the book. But he also has sections about best popes, worst popes, sort of in-between popes. And there you get his evaluations of these popes, the McBrien appraisals of the popes. Who was absolutely worst, who was absolutely best.
And what's the name of the author?
The name of this one is Lives of the Popes. I'll pass them around, you can take a look at them. So that's the difference between them. They're both, very usable. The O'Malley one is much more just kind of sit down and have a read. The other is much more I'll look up things in it. So I'll start McBrien that way and O'Malley that way. Thank you.
I gave this one away and I don't know where it went.
Lots of little words in there. Lots of small, big words.
There are, of course, enormous histories of the popes going back to they began doing that in the 19th
O'Malley.
century.
I don't like to.
O'Malley, yeah, that one. And they're multi-volumes. Some of them are very good, some of them are not very good, some of them are very kind of defensive and there's a lot of spin on everything. And some of the more recent ones are very historically sound and solid. Okay, that being said, let's say something else. First of all, if you give the standard Catholic answer to the question, who was the first pope, what is the answer?
Peter.
Peter. And yet that answer needs a lot of quibbling. from a historical point of view, which is the only point of view I can take on this, we know very little about Peter after what we find in the New Testament. Did Peter go to Rome? Not absolutely sure. Did Peter die in Rome? Not absolutely sure. Was Peter martyred in Rome? Not absolutely sure. Did Peter preside in any Bishop of Rome sense in Rome? Not absolutely sure, but almost certainly no for the last one. Nevertheless, not absolutely sure, highly probable that he did go to Rome, highly probable that he died in Rome, highly probable that he was buried and martyred and buried in Rome. Now, why should we think that Peter was of any importance at all in Rome or anywhere else after the Gospel period? Well, first of all, in the Gospels themselves, Peter looms very large. He's prominent, he's clearly represented as the kind of head apostle of the famous, if you go into St. Peter's Basilica now, you see a huge rotunda, and around the top it says in Latin, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Now that is a gospel passage. That's Matthew 16:18. And, that has a lot to do with it. Nevertheless, if you look at that passage, it just says, Jesus said to Peter, "You are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." It doesn't say anything suggesting that Peter's successors are anything much. It doesn't even suggest Peter will have successors. So all of that comes in later. There are two things called letters of Peter in the New Testament. One of them, there's a very good likelihood that Peter wrote. The other one, there's a very great likelihood that he did not. In the first one, he does talk about Rome and going to Rome and all of that. So, quite believable that he was headed for Rome. Same thing you find with Paul, and we do know that Paul got to Rome, and that's the end of the story, so the assumption is that he died in Rome. Beyond that, why would we think that he was of importance as sort of Bishop of Rome? Because that's the tradition. I mean, all the way back, that's what pretty much all Christians thought. And that's got to be based on something. Traditions don't just come out of nowhere. Also, archaeology has made a big dent in it. The archaeologists have found underneath St. Peter's Basilica, which was built by the Emperor Constantine the Great in the 4th century. They found in successive stages something that looks like it might have been the burial place of Peter, and then something with actually inscriptions on it that make it even more likely that it was the burial place of Peter. That's pretty impressive. Constantine clearly thought he knew exactly where Peter died, and he directed his construction people to build the basilica right there. So Constantine and the archaeologists are agreed there that this looks like where Peter was buried. That wasn't known until until your lifetime, probably everybody here. But now it is. Now it's well known, and there's been no counter evidence. Everything looks like, yeah, that was Peter's burial place. So was Peter martyred? If he was there during the persecution of Nero, which was less than a year long, he probably was. Any prominent Christian then that Nero could get his hands on was martyred. But here again, legend tends to take over all, I think the first 27 popes are all saints, and most of them are martyrs. But what we know about them doesn't give us any reason to think that there were 27 very saintly people there, or that there were 27 martyrs there. So this seems to be a tradition imposed. The early popes were saints and martyrs. Some of them were popes during times when there was no persecution anywhere, so who would have martyred them? I mean, that's true of a lot of them. The imperial persecutions in Rome occupied only about 36 or so years of the first 3 centuries. So, most of the time there was no imperial persecution. For much of the time, however, there was kind of local lynch mobs and crowds of unruly people who didn't like Christians, and you went after Christian leaders and kind of lynched them. So that would be a martyrdom too, if that's the reason they were killed, but that's very hard to track down. So I'm just saying that calling them all saints and calling them all martyrs is, as stated, fiction. Some of them were martyrs, some of them were saintly by anybody's standards. But it's very hard now to find out who, because we know so little about these early popes. That just seems to be something that was assumed. Now, let's assume that Peter went to Rome, died in Rome, was martyred in Rome. In order to be the first pope, he has to be Bishop of Rome. And in one sense, that's impossible, because we know that Rome did not have a bishop till the middle of the 2nd century. It had a collegial arrangement whereby different, parish communities had their own, head guy, like a pastor, and they got together and agreed about things. So it was kind of a republican form of church government in Rome. There was no one person who presided over it all. That happened in the middle of the 2nd century. So was Peter one of those people, or was he simply a very honored figure that everybody consulted? There's no way of answering that question. But Peter cannot have been Bishop of Rome in the sense that most of us understand a single bishop of a single city, a single diocese, and so on. So Peter is left a little cloudy in all those respects. It's the traditions about Peter which give rise to the beliefs about Peter, which have a great influence on Christian theology from then on. The facts are cloudy. None of the traditions are counter-indicated. I mean, none of them could be said to be just false, but neither could any historian say they're true either. Who knows? So the sound assumptions are, yes, Peter went to Rome, yes, Peter died in Rome, yes, Peter was buried on the site of the present St. Peter's Basilica. All those things very likely. Beyond that, tradition takes over, and that mix of tradition, in fact, makes it impossible for us to say more than we did. Any questions about that?
Did he have just been an honorary pope?
Did you have what?
An honorary pope. You know how they just said, well, he started it here, and he started all of this stuff, that's why they said...
Oh, you mean later on?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. We'll be seeing in this course how Peter and Rome and the Bishop of Rome get kind of pulled together, and Peter is seen as kind of mystically present in Rome and imparting his authority to the existing pope and so on. That's kind of what you mean, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there an approximate date of death? I mean, how long did Peter
Of Peter's death?
Martyred?
Somewhere in the middle 60s. Around the same time as Paul. Some people think they died, within months of one another. Yes. Oh, yeah.
It's kind of said at times that while Peter has this, he's the head and everything, that the church was really tremendously kind of formed by Paul.
Yeah, true.
And that he probably had greater kind of influence, but he never was Pope.
No, he never was Pope, and if you remember from Acts of the Apostles, when Peter goes to Rome, there's already a big thriving Christian community in Rome.
Right.
They come out and meet him. He's being taken to prison, but he's under very light guard. He's kind of well treated as prisoners go. And they come out to meet him, and that's kind of the last we hear of him. We hear that he was under very light house arrest after that, and then died. They guess Nero, because Nero was the only one running around murdering Christians at that time. Paul certainly had a great influence on the rest of the church. Paul's influence on the church in Rome, in the city of Rome, is much more questionable. You know, he wrote his letter to the Romans. That was a kind of a theological tract, and it certainly influenced things there, but there's no indication that he ever kind of ran things in Rome, always looked to by the Romans as the, you know, the final appeal for anything. Is that answering it?
Did he have a mother-in-law?
Did Peter have a mother-in-law? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a Mrs. Peter as well.
Yeah.
Mrs. Peter.
Now, what became of Mrs. Peter is anybody's guess.
There
Sent
again,
to a
There
concert.
certainly was not the first POPES.
again, that's archaeology, isn't it?
But
Of Peter having this home on the banks of the
Oh,
Sea
that
of
is.
Galilee.
yeah, the location of it, yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen that. But, you know, the gospel refers to Peter's mother-in-law. They go there and have dinner and so on. And you can't get a mother-in-law without a wife.
That's why they came up with convents, so they'd have some place to say these people.
Right, right. I remember Paul says, at one point, Paul is criticized for not having a wife,
Right.
which is still somewhat puzzling because Jewish religious people always had wives. That was kind of part of being a full grown-up. Paul responds, in his response, he says, all of the apostles take their wives around with them. So they all had wives, all of the other apostles. So he's saying, yeah, I'm an exception. We know everybody else drags these women around with them. I don't do that. I don't have time. And he's kind of saying that. He's saying that liberates me much more to go where I need to go, do what I have to do, and so on. But he certainly takes for granted that the apostles all had wives. The church regulations and customs against priests and bishops having wives began very early, within the 2nd century, even before Constantine and all of that. And at first the arrangement was you can have a married bishop, but the married bishop, once he's bishop, can no longer have sex with his wife. This is in the job description.
Was it in her job description?
Was it what?
Her job is.
So, so that took hold very, very early, and then that was extended to priests who could not have wives at all. If they became priests and had wives, they had to kind of, you know, take care of them outside and not have them there anymore. There was a synod in Spain, a Synod of Elvira in the 2nd century, which is kind of the sex and marriage synod of the early church. It has all these very strict regulations about celibacy in it. But I just want you to know the celibacy thing is not a recent phenomenon. It goes back to very, very early. And then when monks came into the picture, they are not in the picture yet, they tended to be regarded as the kind of ideal Christians. They were the most serious of all Christians. And they took a vow of celibacy. And so when legislation was imposed on secular priests, it always was to kind of make them a little more monastic. And that would include celibacy. Monks were kind of the model, and priests, because they, parish priests couldn't live like monks all in one big monastery or anything, but they should live as much like monks as feasible, given their roles in the church. Okay, so the celibacy thing is way, way back. And doesn't seem to have been, doesn't seem to have been challenged much. It wasn't challenged much formally, but it was ignored very, very widely. I mean, many bishops had wives, and they just, didn't take them to meetings. And many priests had wives. And again, there were, uprisings. This is nonsense, the priests wanting to be able to have wives. That comes up again and again and again. But for the most part, there was really no time when there were not a lot of priests with wives, but there were virtually no times when that was officially okay. It was not okay. But sometimes that was pursued, and sometimes it was ignored. And that was very much influenced by the people. If the people felt very well served by a priest who had a woman, then it would be very hard to get rid of him without an uprising among the people. We had a great guy here, and he's married, that's not a sin. So leave him alone. Those things happened repeatedly. Yeah.
I'm wondering where the priesthood come from. I see no indication in the Bible of Jesus setting up this kind of a hierarchical structure.
The hierarchical structure, no. As I say, there's nothing about Peter and his successors. It's just Peter, a single individual Peter, within the context of the New Testament history. I remember too, Jesus expected the end of everything very soon. Yeah. So why construct a great hierarchy if there's not much time left? That wouldn't make much sense. So the hierarchical organization begins within the New Testament. You begin to see it with letters like 1 Peter and your Timothy and things like that. And then, part of this course will be see how it grows and expands and takes on gradually the form it has now. It took it a long time to take on the form it has now, but by the 6th century, the Pope's centrality was pretty well guaranteed, and therefore his authority over others was kind of guaranteed. But in the 1st century, you find bishops of Rome kind of telling other bishops, this is what your people should do, and the other bishops saying, who are you to tell me what my people should do? You're the bishop of Rome, I'm the bishop of Capua, or something like that. So there was a strong belief in the equality of bishops, that there was a prestige that went with the Bishop of Rome because of Peter and all, but that did not extend into authority. Not a you can tell us what to do. So that came in quite gradually.
Jim, how were bishops put into place? Were they elected?
How were they then?
Put into place.
Okay, at that time, not now.
At that time.
At that time, they were generally put into place by the election or acclamation of the people.
Okay.
They were not appointed by any superior authority. Certainly the Pope did not appoint bishops.
Right.
A little later, emperors began appointing bishops, but that's a merging of the empire and the church. But initially it was either election or acclamation. Everybody wants so-and-so for our bishop. Anybody not, no hands go up. So he's bishop.
What were the big dioceses at the time of Peter and Paul developing?
What were they?
Alexandria,
Antioch,
Antioch,
Constantinople, of course,
Constantinople,
and Rome, Milan, shortly afterward. That becomes the biggest.
St. Ambrose, yeah.
Right. Those would be the big ones, and Marseille was a fairly substantial one. So the big cities of North Africa, Egypt, and Italy. That would be pretty much it.
When did the concept of ordination come in, and then that being a sacrament?
A long time after.
A long time after.
Yeah, I mean, the practice was there, but it became part of the required practice of the church
Right,
with the Council of
required.
Trent. That's in the 16th century.
But very
But it was
early
going on.
people were somehow ritualistic, ordained by acclamation or whatever,
Yeah,
to be put in service,
yeah.
okay, of the community.
I mean, they had to be ordained priests.
Right,
mean,
but
that
they
was-
had a ritual
Yeah,
to do that.
for that, yeah.
And the bishop of that area did it, I mean, was that the hierarchy?
Yeah,
Okay.
really, any bishop could do
Any
it,
bishop.
yeah. It was all pretty loose. And there were some cases in which a dying bishop of Rome said, just kind of said, my successor will be so-and-so.
Okay.
And nobody questioned that. So that could become kind of dynastic, but it wasn't always that way. So it depended on local circumstances, We love this Bishop of Rome. He says Sam here should be the next pope. We're not gonna argue with him on his deathbed. Sam, you're in. So you do have to appreciate the looseness of it at that time. And part of what we'll see in this course is the tightening up of it. I mean, a lot of things that you could do various ways, eventually you can do only one way. And that could only happen with the centralization of power somewhere, and the only somewheres where that could happen would be the imperial city, Constantinople, or the papal city, Rome. And they're in conflict to some extent. The general councils of the church, the ecumenical councils, the first 5 of them didn't have any popes at them, and they were called by the emperor.
Oh.
And the emperor appointed delegates and so on.
The whole question of union of church and state almost to our present day.
Oh, yeah,
Goes
yeah.
way back, yeah.
By 380, the Christian church was regarded as the state church. And by 325, it was highly privileged by the state. Constantine was tolerant of pagans. They could stay pagans. But he was pushing Christianity and enriching Christianity and trying to advance the cause of Christianity. But you didn't have to be a Christian. Later on, if you weren't a Christian, you were without civil rights, essentially. And that affected me. The pagans were pretty well gone, but the Jews were there. And the Jews were without civil rights for centuries and centuries.
Constantine's kind of pushing of the Christian church forward or alliance with it, that it wasn't particularly spiritually. I had heard somewhere he really didn't convert or whatever until on his deathbed.
He didn't.
So what was his, did he see it politically advantageous to align with this, but particularly wasn't particularly religiously attracted, or what?
I think it was religiously colored, but I think it was mainly administrative, and that's what you're
Okay.
suggesting. Constantine was a very smart guy,
Yeah.
as
obviously.
well as a great military leader and all. And I think he perceived better than anyone else had that Christianity was growing and nothing else was growing. So the future lay with Christianity. There were already Christians in the imperial household. Well, it's kind of ironic in a way. Some of the influence that later popes will have with the emperor would be through the emperor's Christian mistress. There's some irony there. I mean, we know them by name. We know quite a bit about them. Getting back to your question. Constantine seems to have had or thought he had a vision at the Mulvian Bridge. And this was his moment of conquest. That's when he conquered his rival and won. And he saw a sign in the heavens saying, in this sign you will conquer. And there was a kind of cross there. Now, he clearly took this very seriously. I mean, he did see something, whether subjective or objective, who knows. But he had a religious experience.
Okay.
And that religious experience made him strongly sympathetic to the Christians. But it went along with his administrative recognition that the future seems to lie with the Christians. They're everywhere. They're more everywhere every day than they were the day before. They're at every level of society now.
Did his mother, Constantine's mother, have a lot to do with that?
Oh, she was a very devout Christian, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
She made the famous pilgrimage to Palestine, to Jerusalem to try to find the true cross, and had churches built along her way and things like that. Yes, yeah, Helena was a very, very devoutly Christian.
But Constantine was not baptized until right near his death.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, which again implies that there was not that rigid a view that if you're not baptized, you're doomed. He wasn't taking that kind of chance, I don't think. But yeah, he postponed baptism until close to his death. But yeah, you're right, Helena was a big spiritual influence there.
What about administratively? I mean, do you think she had influence as far as the Christians getting the influence that they
I don't think directly, but she had a lot of influence with her son.
That's what I thought.
It was personal influence. But if Helena was strongly for something, he would probably not be against it, at least.
She was kind of like Monica. She was kind of like Monica with Augustine, in terms of the influence.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a mother.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah.
I'm not saying.
Part of his life, Augustine seems to have been very much a mother's boy. Yeah. And of course, she was sainted very early. She was called Saint Helena very early. But Constantine was called Saint Constantine very early. And to this day, Constantine is a saint in the Eastern Church. There's a feast of Saint Constantine. Kind of ironic, when Dante wrote the Paradiso, he naturally meets all kinds of historically holy people in paradise, and one of them he meets is Constantine. And it's interesting from, this is the 13th century, 14th century. Dante meets Constantine, and first of all he expresses his pleasure at being able to meet him, and then he says, "Oh, Constantine, what a torrent of misery you released when you made a pope rich." Because he's looking back at all the corruption that came with the enrichment of the papacy. And Constantine meant this well. He did enrich the papacy, gave them land, gave them money, and so on. But increasingly, there were more and more popes who were totally corrupted by money grubbing and family enriching and things like that.
And he gave them power? As he gave them the monetary thing, but he also gave them power?
He didn't give them much power, actually, and that's reflected in the fact that the first councils he presided over, not the Pope. The Pope wasn't even there. It's also interesting to notice that all of the the early ecumenical councils of the Church were in Asia, not in Italy. They were all, you look at the places: Nicaea, Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople. These are the locations, and they're all in or near what is now Turkey. Which meant they were in the emperor's territory, not in the Pope's. And for the first 4 councils, the Pope didn't even show up. After that, he sent envoys who had serious influence. But Constantine ran the church. Agreeably to there was no conflict. But the popes clearly just stood back and said, this is our big moment. The guy with all the power likes us. So, don't mess it up. So the popes during Constantine's era are very inconspicuous. You don't find out much about them. The one you find out much about is entirely fictional, the fiction of Constantine having given the world to the Pope. That's brought out in a forged document that comes out 500 years later for political purposes, but he didn't. And yet, curiously, I remember, I think I mentioned this in one of the classes before, the Catholic Encyclopedia before last still had that as real.
Oh, really?
Kind of astonishing. Wow. Because scholars everywhere had known for 300 years that it was a forgery. So there was a kind of defensiveness among the editors of the Catholic Encyclopedia. And then they got very different editors after that. And now their view is the same as everybody else's. It's a forgery, a famous forgery. But yeah, we'll get to that and see why there was a forgery and why it worked. But according to that forgery, Constantine just turned the world over to the Pope and said, you'll need an emperor kind of as your deputy to administer secular affairs, but you own the world. And that's why, I mean, jumping way forward, when they discovered America, the New World and all, the Pope parceled it out, Spain, you get this much, South America, Portugal, you get this piece, which is now Brazil, and that's what happened. I mean, that's why today's map is the way it is, because of a papal real estate arrangement. Did not consult Native Americans, of course, and also Africa part of Africa went the same way. So that was all based on this idea that if you had unoccupied territory, then the head real estate administrator was the Pope, and he would tell you who got it.
Unoccupied by Christians.
Yeah.
It was occupied.
Yeah, but
that
doesn't count.
They didn't count.
And that's why also it was always, but we will be spending time on that, it was always linked to evangelizing. We are coming over and taking over, and they should be delighted because we're also going to teach them Christianity. If
God and gold.
They're good.
God and gold, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, back to the earliest period. What did I want to say about that? That I haven't said, okay, a lot. The few popes we know much about are Pope Clement. All we know is that he must have been there because he got in a quarrel with St. Cyprian, who was a writer, a theologian, he's there in black and white. And St. Cyprian wrote to Clement, the Pope, telling him that he was overextending his authority, that he could not tell other bishops what to do. This still comes up, even at Vatican II it came up, because, to this day, who the bishops are has never really been pinned down. Everything is about popes. And Vatican II hoped to have a section on bishops in which their basic authority and sphere of jurisdiction would be mapped out. They didn't get it. But St. Cyprian was quoted again and again in those discussions because he said, you are a bishop, and there are other bishops too, and a bishop is a bishop, and they're not just kind of sort of bishops. So that's the first thing that's kind of real in the history of the early papacy, a quarrel between St. Cyprian and Pope Clement, about whom we know nothing much else. There's a letter of Clement that may or may not have been written by him, but we don't know.
What year was that? What year was that?
Clement was in within the first, let's say he was around, getting close to 100, Clement.
Oh, 100?
Yeah.
Okay.
An early one.
That's early.
It is early, yeah. But, that's all we know about it. We wouldn't know even that if we didn't have Cyprian. Now, just a kind of indication of what popes were like and what the society was like is take a look at an interesting pope. Pope Calixtus. There's a list of popes on the back of this. I just want to see how many I'm skipping. A lot.
Do they even have names for all of these popes?
Oh yeah, they all have names, but whether they're real names or not. You asked me about Clement. That was 96, so close to 100. Yeah, but that's all we know about him. Then the next one that I want to say anything about is in the 3rd century, beginning in 217, and that's Pope Calixtus. Pope Calixtus was a slave initially. He was a smart slave, and his master decided to put him in charge of the budget of his estate and businesses. So he was an accountant working for this guy. And he did some money laundering and stole some money and was caught and was imprisoned, and then more evidence was brought to bear on him. He seems really to have been guilty of this. And he was exiled to Sardinia to work in the mines. So off he went to Sardinia to work in the mines, and that could have been the end of the story of Calixtus, but it wasn't. Because Pope Stephen, who came in, had influence with a woman named Marcia, who was a mistress of the emperor.
Oh.
And he said, you know, a lot of nice Christians, well-meaning Christians, have been exiled to Sardinia, and they served their term. Couldn't we let them out? You know, they're not a threat to society. And Marcia persuaded the emperor to let a lot of them out. But that did not include Calixtus. Calixtus, however, managed to get into the crowd. He clearly was a shrewd guy. You know, everybody but you is leaving, and he gets in, sort of hops in the boat at the last minute, and Calixtus is free by his own workings.
Wild.
So Calixtus gets back to Rome, and Pope Stephen is impressed by him. And at the end of his own term, he hopes Calixtus will be the next pope, and Calixtus gets to be the next pope. So, you know, quite a history from slave to felon to mine worker, hard labor, to escaped convict to pope.
Does he get to be a priest in between?
He gets to be a deacon in between, and then they make him pope. Yeah. So he's a little remarkable that way. Stephen, his protector, was of the highest nobility, and so he could hobnob with the mistress of the emperor. So it's kind of interesting. Here's somebody from the very dregs of society, slave, convict, and so on, being taken care of by somebody from the upper echelon, and it gives you an idea of the great social disparity among the popes. And that, I think, is kind of refreshing. You know, you do not have to be a big shot to be pope.
But I mean, if he was a slave, that doesn't mean that he wasn't from a good family, or he wasn't from a well...
No, we know nothing about him beyond
nothing
that,
about
no.
him.
No.
Right.
He seems to have been a North African, but that's about all we know. No, it doesn't, but if he was a big aristocrat, he wouldn't be a slave. They didn't enslave big aristocrats. They paid something. Got off that way. Either you pay your fine, and they would always pay their fine.
Were they called popes at the time, or were they called bishops?
They were called popes, but so were a lot of other people. I mean, pope basically just means father. Pope is papa, and papa means father. And that term was originally applied to, what we would call pastors, you know, priestly leaders of a community, and to bishops, and including the Bishop of Rome. Gradually, it becomes more and more exclusively the bishops, and then exclusively the Bishop of Rome. In the Eastern Church, it's still more widely distributed because they have popes too now. I mean, the Egyptian Christian Church has a pope, and I think the Armenians have a pope, and they call him pope. But it's a term that was originally very broad, and it got narrowed and narrowed and narrowed down. And other titles of the bishops of Rome come along for various reasons. Pontiff, that was a pagan term. The Pontifex Maximus was the high priest of pagan Rome. And when he is displaced, it became kind of natural. Well, we still have a high priest of now Christian Rome, so he's the new pontiff. So it's a pagan term transferred onto the Christian leader. Vicar of Peter was around before Vicar of Christ. Vicar of Christ comes very late. And we'll see it coming and why it comes later on. Vicar of Peter was commoner before that. Other titles, oh yeah, well then there are political titles, but that's after the Pope becomes a secular monarch. You know, then he's king or whatever you want to call him. And he gets all those royal titles. And that will be a big part of the story of the Pope becoming a secular leader, a political dictator, really, and then losing that again. And I think nothing better has ever happened to the papacy than losing that.
When, in the flow of things, and I would think it was a little bit later on, did the whole structure become very royal in terms of having cardinals and, you know, you had cardinals and you had bishops and then you just had this kind of royalty, kind of simulating
Like a court,
what a
yeah.
court
Yeah.
would be like.
Yeah. Well, that becomes more and more and more so.
Okay.
But I'd say it begins with maybe Leo in the 5th century,
Okay.
and then more so with the two greats, Leo the Great and Gregory the Great. And then it goes farther and farther. The more the Pope invests in his papal states, his secular holdings. And, you know, eventually, you know, the popes, sadly, the popes were much more interested in that than in anything having to do with spirituality or religion. You know, the popes had an army, they had a navy, they sometimes led the army themselves, you know, just like other monarchs there. Their navy, sadly enough, was manned entirely by slaves, which made them pro-slave, of course. So, I mean, that I think is the low tide of the papacy,
Yeah.
when being head of the papal states, a rival of these other states, became the main thing for popes. At that time, you see almost no religious aura about the Pope at all. Another curious thing is the modern historians have looked for what people thought about the Pope. And what they found is people didn't think about the Pope at all until very recent times. You know, they looked through correspondence, sermons. The Pope is never mentioned. You know, the Pope was well known to heads of state. So the Pope was familiar to people who did business with him, negotiations with him on a high level. But outside the city of Rome, the Pope was not significant to people. He had an impact on them because he had an impact on their bishop, who had an impact on them. But even the prayers don't include the Pope. Sermons never mention the Pope. And private letters never mention the Pope. Even very religious letters that you'd think might mention the Pope, they just don't. So, you know, the Pope is so prominent in modern Catholicism that we tend to assume he always was.
Yeah.
For most of history, he was not. That comes about after in the Middle Ages and after the Middle Ages. And I guess I have 2 minutes to go.
2 minute warning.
Tell you that man. Who is that man with that big sign?
Jim, this clock is correct.
Yeah, that's an actually
That's
correct
an
clock.
atomic clock, and it's correct.
Okay.
It's the only correct clock in this whole building.
Then let me mention one more thing about the earliest popes. There was a Pope Victor in the 3rd century, who was the first pope to kind of try to extend his influence outside the city of Rome. And what it was about was the date of Easter. When do we celebrate the resurrection? Because people were celebrating at different times. Some every Sunday, for some every Sunday was Easter. Others were following the Passover thing, having a Passover time. And he decided that this at least ought to be uniform. So he sent out a message calling on everyone to take the same date. And he got a lot of answers that said, who are you to tell us when it's going? At the same time, it did sink in slowly, and they all began celebrating Easter at the time we do now, based on Pentecost.
So they didn't have infallibility as an old.
Infallibility is not even mentioned until the 19th century. Never mentioned. It's a brand new. And that's why it was such a shocker to Protestants particularly.
The calendar itself, Pope Gregory the Great, just a switch from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar.
Right.
That was quite an upheaval too, wasn't it?
Oh, certainly it was.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't the Eastern Church celebrate Easter at a different time?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, at some different times, different Eastern churches. Yeah. So it didn't extend that far. Okay. I should get out of here.
We should all get out of here.